still. Okay, so my name is Odilile Ayodele. I'm with the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. I am the head of the Digital Africa Research Unit, and this important webinar today is organized by Bonani Petla, who is one of our researchers focusing on social media misinformation. You know, as many people know, we've begun election season, and one of the biggest democracies on the continent, Nigeria, starts kicking off this weekend with their elections. Now, misinformation or disinformation around elections affects the electoral processes, and to have a safe and effective election, it's important to have solid information being shared. And already, especially in the case of Nigeria, we're already seeing misinformation and disinformation being shared and affecting trust in the system. I believe that this evening will be a very fruitful discussion. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to our chair, Dr. Nyere.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odilile, and greetings, colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. My name is Chidochashe Nyere, and I will be chairing this session today. And thank you so much, Dr. Odilile, for the introduction. And I'm here to chair the session, but I also want to firstly introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker for this evening, for those of you who are using my time, is Dr. Alexander Rusero. Dr. Alexander Rusero is a Letsema visiting research fellow with the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. Thank you so much for that screen. Dr. Rusero is a holder of a PhD in International Relations with the University of Pretoria. He is also a senior lecturer of International Relations, Politics, and Journalism with 15 years of university teaching, having taught at Harare Polytechnic School of Journalism and Media Studies, Africa University's Colleges of Social Sciences, Theology, Humanities, and Education, as well as Great Zimbabwe University's Department of Politics and Public Management. Dr. Rusero is an author of 10 academic textbooks and has more than 10 peer-reviewed book chapters and journal papers related to media, democracy, and human rights, international relations, and foreign policy, media, libraries, and archives, as well as Pan-Africanist thought and decoloniality. So over to you, Dr. Rusero. Kick us on with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Doc, for the kind introduction. It was very kind of you to introduce me that way. Having said that, I'm going to look at the topical theme of the day, social media misinformation. And because where I hail from, and greetings to all the listeners, viewers of our program, where I hail from, Zimbabwe, we are also in that stupid season of elections, which are scheduled to take place anytime between March and July, according to the time that the president may deem necessary. But we hope by the other half of the year, we will be having a new government, new pronounced head of state, etc., based on the electoral outcome. Now, when you are looking at this whole issue that we are going to deliberate, the whole idea is that there is an organic link between democracy and the free flow of information that is supposed to be truthful, the free flow of information that is supposed to be authentic, the free flow of information that is supposed to make people wiser at the end of the day. So the purpose of information from the onset is that when you hear certain information, you must be wiser than you were before you heard that information. But contrary to this idealistic postulation that I have just made, the information that we daily consume as citizens on a day-to-day basis in Africa, the Global South, Zimbabwe, South Africa, wherever you are, it is making us more idiotic than where we were prior to hearing that kind of information. So we will also deliberate on what needs to be done, having said that. So the world in general and developing world in particular, we are reeling under what is called devastating production and consumption of fake news. Because at the end of the day, the information that we are deeming to be misinforming, disinforming, the outcome is fake news. It is called the fake news. One might want to ask, how can then news be fake? It is called the fake news because of the degree at which it is an appeal, the degree at which it also spreads, courtesy of the proliferation of digital media technologies. So at the end of the day, what is supposed to be fact is converted into fake. And what is supposed to be information is converted into misinformation. I wanted to ask Doc because the challenge I also have is that I tend to speak so much. How much time do I have?
Thank you, Dr. Rusero, for that question. I should have stated it outrightly. So you will have 15 minutes to make your presentation. Then we would want to immediately engage you in a question and answer session.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, Doc. I will try very much, although, you know, it is an unforgivable sin to give orators 15 minutes. We'll still be introducing ourselves, the weather, etc. here in Africa. You know, it's an African. But I'll try. So when you are looking at the whole idea of fake news or misinformation at a broader level, it stands on the postulation of some five particular pillars that I have come out with. The first one, we are looking at hoaxes, because remember, we are talking about social media misinformation in the context of elections, bearing in mind that most of the key focus of Africa in terms of the states, they are conducting elections this year. Nigeria occupies a critical space as the widest democracy in the continent. But there is also something special about Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe's deliberation will determine the extent at which our region as SADC will react on the elections. Because in Zimbabwe, elections are more than just a contest for office. They are also something to do with a site of struggle. Elections are actually a site of struggle here in Zimbabwe. Just a moment, one second.
True to form, orators tend to speak a lot, but also tend to digress. And I just hope Dr. Rusero comes back to us in a short while. Please hang in there.
Thank you. I am back. You know, the tragedies of working from home. So I was talking about these 5 pillars where they are the anchors of misinformation with regards to issues pertaining our discussion today, issues to do with the African election season, and what then will be the dangers that will be posed by issues of misinformation. So usually misinformation normally comes as hoaxes. It comes as a hoax, and that hoax is actually too good not to believe. That hoax then feeds into a certain narrative that will be sustained as fake news. But oftenly you would realize that governments that seek to continue in power, as is the case in Nigeria, of course, as the case in Zimbabwe, Politics by nature longs for longevity. It is in the nature of power to stay in power for the umpteenth time. So they normally churn out propaganda, and propaganda in its excess obviously will result in misinformation. So you would want to run away with the bag, and to do so, you will overall end up misinforming and also parodying fake news. But then you will also have aspects of a disinformation, that's deliberate attempt by office holders to disinform for the specific purposes of scoring a certain narrative, a certain agenda. In addition also to issues of populism, you want to misinform, you want to spread fake news because you want to sustain populism that you have acquired over time. Then lastly,
Dr. Rusero,
yes.
Dr. Rusero, sorry to interject. There is a request here that you now can put on your camera. I know we had trouble earlier, but that has been rectified, and I've put myself on camera just to prove that. So if you may, please put yourself on camera, even if it means just for 2 minutes, so that we can see the face that's making the presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, that's my beautiful library there in my background. So at the end of the day, you would also realize that there is what I call colonial matrix of power within the equation of our information sharing, cross-pollination of our information. We must also be wary because there is a growing trend of what is being called the coloniality of data. So at the end of the day, you may think that you own your Facebook wall, you own your Twitter wall, you own all the digital platforms. But these digital platforms, they are not ours, they don't belong to us. So at the end of the day, they can also be hijacked and can also be useful platforms to spread misinformation. But what is it then that is topical within the context of our discussion, in as much as social media misinformation is concerned? There is a danger to misinformation because a democracy heavily relies on informed people. It can only be an informed people when they adequately make decisions that have a bearing in their lives. And we are talking about elections. Elections in Africa in general and the entire world, they are the greatest yardstick to measure whether a country is adhering to become a democracy or not, provided that such kind of election is conducted freely and fairly. And one of the epitome outcomes of ascertaining whether an election has been free or fair pertains to issues to do with the access to information, issues to do with the sharing that information, issues to do with the how then the powers that be react to the shared information. So information becomes what UNESCO calls a public good. It is an essentiality of life. Just like we need water, we need shelter, we need the food. It is the obligation of every given state to ensure that its citizens consume healthy information. By healthy information, I mean uncensored and unfiltered information, because we are living in an infosphere web where we are now prosumers. We are no longer just consumers of information, because this information is also us who produce that kind of information. So in a healthy democracy, people should be able to access information that would then automatically lead them to make informed decisions. So the reflective outcome of an election should be a signal, should be a signifier of a people who would have accessed useful, relevant, truthful information aimed at them making informed decisions. So that's where the danger is, because the social media usually plays the referee and the player at the same time. And social media is also a no holds barred kind of platform. We have also seen social media itself, instead of promoting democracy, it's actually one of the greatest anathemas of democracy, so to speak, because whatever is posted there, it's posted in real time. There are no there is no regard to issues to do with the ethics. There are no regards to issues to do with even morality, well-being. There are now simmering issues of hate, simmering issues of fueling conflict, and simmering issues of fueling the temperatures, especially as we go for an election. So we have a topical issue in Zimbabwe where actually misinformation has taken precedence. So after the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, ZEC, has finished its delimitation report, it is supposed to submit it to the president, and the president would then gazette the delimitation report, which would reflect the constituencies that the political parties would contest, etc. So the delimitation report actually is the anchor of an election. But as it is right now, it is mired in controversy. Abazi said the president was given the delimitation report behind the scenes by the Electoral Commission so as to temper and tinker it in his favor and his political party's and PF's favor without the knowledge of the citizens or any other given party. So up to now, there are a lot of conflicting statements pertaining delimitation, pertaining the delimitation report, which has since been gazetted into law, are shrouded in those kind of mysteries. So when there is absence of authentic information, it validates or sustains certain narratives, which if they are not handled properly, they will degenerate into conflict, degenerate into war, inter-party conflicts. In addition to that, in Zimbabwe, we have now what are called the cyber cadres or cyber warriors. These are people that are deployed on social media specifically to crash everything that others would have posted, which tends to be an alternative view. So if I am on payroll and I hate everything, or Delile, Ayodele, I just stand guided to make sure Ayodele posts something which I crash, which I dismisses, and then fuel hate aimed at degenerating hate, instinctive hatred on whatever Ayodele would have said. So social media ought to be regulated in a certain way so as to foster a fully-fledged democracy, because as it is right now, it has become the most threat to the democracy that it is supposed to cherish. And at the end of the day, you would realize that the dividends of social media are actually now being converted into the divides of social media upon the society, primarily when we come to issues to do with the elections, sharing of information, cross-pollination of ideas. So I think I would want to stop here for now, Dr. Nyere, then we will pick it from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rusero, for your presentation. I think you have set a very good tone for some points to be explained and also for some points to be expounded on. Before I open the floor for questions, you spoke about a very interesting upcoming election in Zimbabwe. And I just want to share my thoughts. I'm abusing my privilege of chairing this session. I want to share some of my thoughts that I think you may want to intercolute and engage, but also would want to hear your considered views, seeing that you are based in Zimbabwe and you have written quite a lot on elections in Zimbabwe. Now, the population of Zimbabwe stands at 15 million. And of that 15 million, it's about 67% of that population that are young people. So the youth of Zimbabwe is about 67%. Now, I'm wondering, in terms of social media or the digital platforms, as you called them, how are we harnessing the youth dividend so that it enhances democracy as you argued. Maybe think of that, and I would want now to open the floor to questions, and let's engage what Dr. Rusero has presented for us. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. Are there any questions? I would ask for assistance from Bonani and all the other people behind the scenes to just check if there are any questions in the chats or any hands raised. Yes, I see there is a hand there. Qinisani Pambili Bebe. Qinisani, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Qinisani, I can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Rusero, for the wonderful presentation. But one thing, caught my attention, and well, I just wanted some clarity, or for us. Hello.
We seem to have lost you, Qinisani. Maybe if you check your bandwidth, you can reconnect, and we will come back to your question, unless you are there.
Hello?
All right, I am not hearing. Hi, Qinisani.
Yes, sorry. I was just saying something just caught my attention, and well, I just wanted to have some clarity. Dr. Rusero talks about, information, well, people not wanting information that is censored, and I think he termed social media as a base where information is uncensored. I just wanted some clarity. Is information that flows from social media uncensored, or is information that comes from social media, does information that comes from social media have what we call limited censorship? That's my
right.
my question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Qinisani. I'm sure Dr. Rusero noted that question. I see there is a question here. Samantha Nengomasha says, great background on the emergence of misinformation and its nature. Are there any safety nets, indicators that help social media users to discern between accurate and misinformation? So maybe let's give Dr. Rusero an opportunity to respond. Maybe before that, I see there's a hand there. Vonani, go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening to Dr. Rusero. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was just really interesting. My question is on you speaking about the ability to then regulate the misinformation on social media, right? I want to find out how we do that. For example, in terms of the Nigerian elections that are coming up, I think in 4 days, we find that it's the people that are running for the presidency or for the elections, right? That's then send their people to spread this misinformation, for lack of better word, right? And we've also sort of realized that these social media companies, at the end of the day, their businesses, even though they might be obliged to sort of try combat the misinformation, their efforts are sort of not as great. So who then has the responsibility or the power to sort of then combat the misinformation? Thank you.
Thank you, Wanani, for your question. So there are 4 questions now. Maybe it's an opportune time to give Dr. Rusero an opportunity to respond to the 4 questions before we take another round. Over to you, Dr. Rusero.
Thanks, brother Chido. I will start with yours, the youth bulge that you have made reference to. Yeah, generally Zimbabwe is a young nation. The demographic is one where you would realize that a lot of people are below the age of 40, meaning under normal circumstances, that is the kind of populace that should be in charge of determining the future outcome. You can't have a president who is 80 years old presiding over a Vision 2030 or something. It's awkward, but this is Africa, yay. But having said that, we are not going to realize the harnessing of that potential because the problem in Zimbabwe is that Zimbabwe does not have consensus. We do not have a clearly defined national question. Zimbabweans hardly agree on anything. I can tell you because I have had an experience in Zimbabwe and South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, etc. Zimbabweans, they do not agree on anything, including even the national team. Others would think that supporting a national football team, it's tantamount to supporting ZANU-PF, etc. So if we do not have that kind of consensus, we are unlikely going to have any form of convergence, even on social media. That's why the level of toxicity on social media, it's so appealing, it's so scary, the level at which people are so toxic. So Zimbabwe, naturally, they are an angry people. They are just angry. Even if you just post an egg without saying anything, people start descending on each other, even on meaningless items that would have been posted on social media. So there is no way we can harness the 67% of the populace which uses digital media platforms when we have issues of a lack of national consensus. Actually, that kind of demography is a ticking time bomb in as much as a not so far away conflict amongst the people in Zimbabwe are concerned. Then I move on to Comrade Bebe. He's saying, no, isn't it that because there are certain rules, if you violate them on Facebook, on Twitter, etc., your account will be pulled down. But that's why I made reference to issues of the colonial matrices of power and issues of coloniality of data. Those issues that tend to be restricted, they do not have anything to do with our values, our norms and beliefs, precisely as Africans. So at the end of the day, if you send a nude pic, for Facebook, it's okay. For Twitter, it's okay, but it might not be okay for me. So those are some of the issues. Social media in the current context, it's a rogue platform. It's actually a rogue platform to the extent that you can only be there at your own risk because you can be bashed, because all forms of hate, all forms of insults can be hurled at you without anyone protecting you. This cannot happen on the conventional media, or what I would want to call legacy media, the newspaper, the television, the radio. These things cannot be done in terms of the proportion and the gravity because they at least adhere to certain codes of conduct called media ethics. There are no social media ethics. It's a rogue platform where everyone posts whatever he or she might feel to post for, as long as it is within the parameters of the owners, the conglomerate, the giants owning those platforms. Not something that is aimed at censuring the norms, values, and beliefs, compliance of a given society. So this is closely related to what Samantha raised. Issues of safety nets. There are no safety nets, Tawanda. Samantha, I know of people who have actually pulled down their social media network walls, etc. I will give you an example of a prominent wife of a businesswoman in Zimbabwe called Letsema Siwa. All forms of insults and hate were leveled against her. It was actually a sustained campaign. Guess what? By people who are supposed to be human rights defenders. Her crime was that she is a wife to a husband who has got some subtle ways of sustaining ZANU-PF, according to those allegations. So those kinds of insults, they are not healthy for the mental well-being of citizens. There must be certain ways of taming social media. And unfortunately, people have got social media illiteracy. I think it is also the duty of civil society to also seek and find ways in educating people, especially the youth, on the responsibilities and irresponsibilities with regards to the use and abuse, misuse of our social media, because it is social media which would then purvey issues of misinformation, that misinformation which actually affects the well-being of a society. So there are no social nets as it were currently, and there is need actually to find certain ways of taming the social media, because if we do not do that, it gives authoritarian credence. Whenever authoritarian regimes find something to justify certain actions to stifle democracy, we will always emerge the losers as citizens. That's why in Africa, it is a common feature that towards elections or during the conduct of elections, there is a blackout of information of social media. The governments, they have power to tinker even with the speed of the internet, and at times the whole connectivity is actually lost, and this gives birth to authoritarian resilience. So the onus and discretion is upon us, the citizens, the prosumers, producers and consumers of this information, to be responsible, because if we are not responsible, it's a net cost to democracy, and the outcome is authoritarian resilience. Yet, social media, in a sense, is supposed to demystify and debunk authoritarianism.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Rusero. There are two other questions, or rather three. I see there are two questions, and these are addressed to you, Dr. Rusero. Blessing Balaka says, thank you, Dr. Rusero, for your insightful presentation. I was hooked by your proposition on social media regulations. Here is the question now. How do you propose such an initiative to be policed? I ask this question within the context of hyper-real artificial intelligence, which can generate authentically looking misinformation, such as deep fakes. Question 2, can censorship not lead to McCarthyism rebirthed in favor of the social media's politicized preferences? Right, so those are the two questions from Blessing. And I will also read here, I see Samantha Nengomasha, here's another comment and question. She says cybersecurity laws are being used to criminalize free expression and critical actors on social media, the likes of Daddy Hope. So that's Hopewell Chingono, a renowned Zimbabwean journalist, for those who may not know. This is deterring youth from fighting propaganda and misinformation. Is it therefore true to assume that social media is an undemocratic space where citizens are powerless and maybe irrelevant in relation to free and fair democratic elections? So those are the two people that have posed questions. I see the hands raised. So there is Dr. Rich Mashimbe. Dr. Rich, unmute yourself and pose your question.
Hi, good evening, colleagues. Thanks, Dr. Nyere, for the opportunity. You know, I did my, my PhD on the case of Zimbabwe, the political crisis there. And one of the themes that featured quite prominently during my research, was sort of allegations that were made that the ruling ZANU-PF used to sort of interfere with the work of the national broadcaster there to influence its role as disseminator of information in society. So now, in light of that, and in the context of social media as a sort of a rival platform for dissemination of information, I wanted to check with Dr. Rusero as to what extent is the ZANU-PF able to interfere with the information that is disseminated within these platforms, given that normally it's not as easy, I can imagine, to control social media platforms than it would be to control a national broadcaster. Thanks a lot. I think that's my question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rich. Over to you, Matsidiso Mutsweleng. I see your hand is up. Unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Dr. Rusero, for your presentation. I'm a researcher and intelligence analyst working in the tech space. And I just want to ask Dr. Rusero around what is the role of the Zimbabwean diaspora in creating, receiving, and consuming misinformation around the upcoming elections, especially the role of the current government in creating, you know, an international or what you can say, a cross-border narrative around some of the local issues that have been happening around election campaigning, some of the violence happening against political opponents on the ground, and how that information is filtering through, perhaps through, you know, conventional media or social media, and how that is being consumed and welcomed as a sort of information, disinformation, misinformation in the diaspora community of Zimbabweans living abroad. Secondly, just Dr. Rusero's point about, you know, basically saying that the regulation of what we consume or not consume as citizens, basically the onus lies on us to sort of be able to filter. In a continent like Africa, to a large extent also in the Middle East, where we see a heavy regulation of social media, conventional media, can we really afford to say that we need to tame social media in an era where we're seeing increasingly authoritative governments in Africa, the Middle East, now Eastern Europe in the case of Russia, really controlling and essentially closing down information spaces for citizens for the benefit of government agenda. I mean, historically, propaganda has always existed, especially around, issues of power, elections, etc. Of course, the prominence of social media has sort of exponentially grown that effect around elections. But can we really afford to say that we need measurements, we need more regulation, we need this in terms of social media, especially in a growing global context of very strict governments, authoritative rule, and really the curtailing of information to citizens by governments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matsidiso. Dr. Rusero, I hope you noted all the questions. And may I just interject here and suggest that we go on to the second speaker. And the intention is to make this a discussion in terms of your presentations. I want to bring in the second speaker here so that they share their thoughts, and also we will give Dr. Rusero and every other speaker some time at the end to engage again. So allow me to move on to the second speaker, and you would also appreciate that I am under constraints due to coloniality of time, but also there is the national question on electricity, so I know most of us will be affected. So may I bring in the second speaker here? And the second speaker is Mr. Vusumuzi Gumbi. Vusumuzi Gumbi is a research assistant at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. His BA honors dissertation on the proportional representation electoral system and accountability deficit, and his Master of Arts dissertation on symbolism and voter choice were awarded distinctions. So we are speaking to a very brilliant scholar here. His research interests in elections and political processes and democracy and governance institutions were reinforced when he was deployed by the National Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa to Lesotho in 2017 and to Mozambique in 2019 as part of the electoral team. In 2020, Vusi won season 8 of the South Africa's youth leadership reality show, One Day Leader, which was hosted by the South African Broadcasting Corporation. He has published many opinion editorials in several newspapers in South Africa and beyond. So it is my pleasure to welcome you, Vusi, and over to you. And you also have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Chido, for that introduction. My name is Mrs. Dr. Chido said, and it's my honor and a privilege to address you tonight. I believe that Dr. Rusero, said a mouthful, some of the things that I was going to talk about. But nonetheless, I'm going to start first just by providing context, right? To say over the past decade, social media has exploded around the world to become a leading source of information, news, and dialogue for the public. The growth in the spread and popularity of social media has brought with it great benefits to, obviously, electoral democracy, including the rapid, convenient, and cost-effective distribution of information to the electorate by political parties, candidates, and election management bodies like the IEC, among other stakeholders. But these qualities, which give social media its preferred power and impact, also carry with it grave risks to integrity and electoral processes. There are many examples around the world of the growing influence and the potential on elections of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, as alluded by Dr. Rusero earlier, which are peddled using a variety of social media platforms and digital technologies across democracies in Europe, the United States, and Asia. If you think of the United States, you'd recall that the 2016 presidential elections saw allegations of, Russian involvement, which, depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on, impacted heavily on Hillary Clinton's run to become the first woman president of the United States. So Africa is no exception, right? As social media continues its unrelenting expansion across the continent, so is the risk of undue influence on the electorate rises. Electoral integrity is at the heart of free and fair elections and the continued growth and perseverance on democracy on our continent. This brings me to the context of our event today, considering that there are a number of elections on the African continent this year, including Nigeria, which is a few days away, one of the continent's biggest economy and democracy, are holding their presidential elections. So the question then lingers on how social media platforms are prepared to curb misinformation and disinformation after claims of a botched content moderation during Kenya's polls last year. I believe that a number of us here are privy to the fact that there were disputes to the Kenyan election last year. So concerns ordinarily amounting as it emerges that Twitter has scaled back content moderation after the takeover by Elon Musk. This was seen as reversals on the rules and regulations, the laws that were put in place to make sure that social media plays an active role in ensuring that whenever there are elections, it is at the forefront of making sure that there's no misinformation, no propaganda, considering events like the 2007 elections in Kenya, where it has been proven today that some of the violence that took place then were as a result of some of the things that happened on social media. And now, looking at 14 years later, or 16 years later, and being in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the impact and the magnitude can never have been greater than this. So this is not unique to Twitter. Widely used platforms like your Facebook, your TikTok, WhatsApp, and YouTube have also being fingered, doing a little to stop disinformation and misinformation. Like I said, when I spoke about Nigeria, the outgoing president, Muhammadu Buhari, has voiced concern over how disinformation and misinformation on social media is fanning conflict, insecurity, and distrust in the government in the lead up to the elections over the weekend, even as the country's economy continues to struggle, causing a sense of instability. Yet, as the momentum picks up for what is one of the most hotly contested elections the nation has ever seen, activists, researchers, and scholars like ourselves, and a section of civilians apprehensive about the mounting spread rather of negative campaigning. So this is quite important because this reflects the role of social media in elections. Today, I think the IEC in South Africa conducted a poll last year just to ask what form of communication people preferred during election time. And their poll picked up that a large number of people preferred social media. And this is not surprising, considering, like I said, we're in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Africa has the youngest, population in the world. So we must get to a point where we understand that there's a fine line between promoting access to information and making sure that we curb disinformation, we curb misinformation, right? So when, again, going to Nigeria, and I don't mean to put only the spotlight on Nigeria, but obviously, looking at the political implications of the presidential elections in a country like Nigeria, that the spotlight ought to be there. So Nigeria's youth and tech-savvy population is Africa's most active on social media. The calls for the platforms to step up content moderation, while are not new, follow the increased use of social sites owing to smartphone and internet penetration. This points to what Dr. Rusero said earlier, that there is little, I would say, consequence management, so to speak, on social media. And there are things that are not ordinarily illegal to be there. Like he made an example to say, you might post something that Twitter or Facebook don't see anything wrong about it, but may be wrong and may be offensive to you. And we've seen that in Nigeria, for example, the company that owns Facebook, Meta, claims to have invested in people, including, content moderators and technology to stem the misuse of platforms ahead of elections. The social media giant obviously is also taking some measures as before and during the Kenyan presidential elections of last year, which included verifying the identities of persons posting political advertisements. However, my sentiments around social media and disinformation are that people who believe or who tend to sympathize with the information that they may come across on social media, which may not necessarily be true, are people who ordinarily believe in that thing even before it happens. So what we must get to understand is that although there may be disinformation during elections from social media point of view, that information does little to change the views and perspectives of people generally, because it has been proven that people make their choice way before election day. So, for example, ahead of South Africa's elections next year, people generally have either made up their mind to say they're going to vote for party A or party B. So yes, social media does play a role in misinformation and disinformation and fake news. However, people who tend to be agreeable or to consuming such news or agree with such news are people already who would have held that view ordinarily, right? So if I say, for example, I'm vying for president in South Africa and Dr. Chido doesn't believe I have the capabilities. So if something comes about me which is just false, he's going to believe it even though it's not true. So that thing just reinforces Dr. Chido's perspectives about me. So seldom do fake news change people's views. It seldom happens, right? So that's what we need to know, that although fake news are there, they seldom change people's perspectives about certain issues. For example, in Tigray in Ethiopia, where there have been, wars and all of that. What has now come up is the fact that the people who have been killed because of social media posts, but by people who generally did not, who generally saw them as their nemesis, so to speak. So it is important to say, while it is important to curb misinformation and disinformation, such practices do not necessarily impact on a person's point of view, on how a person, views one candidate over another. So during elections or in the build-up to elections, you get that possibly around maybe 20, 10, 15 of the electorate are undecided. The rest are. So even if I post disinformation on social media, if it comes to a person who does not agree with some of those things, that person is unlikely to believe me. So I'm not sure if I make sense. So if you look at what has happened in Ethiopia again, Abraham Mahak, one of the petitioners, whose father, like I said, Professor Amari was killed during the Tigray war after Facebook posts doxed and called for violence against him. Says that Facebook failed on multiple requests to bring posts about that put his father's life on danger down. Again, those people who may have killed him are not people who killed him because of that post. Those are people who may have wanted to kill him already. So then this begs the question to say, we must get to a point where we make the role of social media or the dangers around social media during election time is more to make sure that, especially now that we live in a polarized continent, a polarized world, make sure that we do not create a fertile ground for violence. That is more the issue than, maybe what misinformation, in my view, what misinformation may or may not do as far as, changing people's minds. Seldom that does happen. So obviously in the African continent, the social media remains central to the permission of political propaganda and dilution of important investigations in matters around economic and social corruption. Therefore, there have been talks around foreign-sponsored campaigns with political objectives that have also affected more than 3/4 of countries in Africa as disinformation campaigns become increasingly sophisticated in camouflaging the origins by outsourcing posting operations. So it is very important, as noted by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies that was published in April last year, to note that most of the time, this social media information is sponsored elsewhere. So this also begs the question of, foreign intervention on African elections. That's one way of looking at it. And also the fact that political incumbents themselves on the continent have tended to ride on social media disinformation to curb political opponents and shut down internet. So there's a variety of ways to look at social media disinformation. And it is very important that we look at the nuances, we look at all the complexities, and make sure that as and when we address these issues, we understand that not one issue is mutually exclusive, that multiple truths around social media disinformation can coexist, that we don't have to choose one over the other. I'm done. I'm looking at time now, and apologies. I'm having load shedding, so I don't have lighting, so apologies for the darkness there. But yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Chido, for the time.
Thank you so much, Vusi, for your very brilliant presentation. Again, we are confronted by many uncomfortable truths that you expose for us. May I also apologize at this stage that I will not be able to be on camera. My gadget here is struggling with battery, so I'm trying to save as much as I can. So there is a question already, Vusi. I'm looking at the question and answer section. Helen says, can the speakers speak about the hacking of social media accounts? by foreign powers that seek to influence African elections, as was the case in the Kenyan elections. Apparently, this happened on the side of Ruto, where one of his election strategists' phone was hijacked by Israeli hackers. So here is the question: is this the case in Nigeria and Zimbabwe? While we wait for everyone else to put on their thinking caps and pose their questions, I also want to just comment, Vusi, thank you so much for highlighting the Nigerian election and how social media is used as a preferred option for communication, particularly by young people. And again, you also correctly noted that governments are unrelenting in terms of exerting undue influence on social media. And that also tends to affect electoral processes. Now, since social media has become almost a corollary of young people, are young people involved in the electoral processes? In other words, are we seeing the presence of young people on social media translating into political and electoral participation? All right, so that's the question I have for you, Vusi. While you note that, I see there are other questions here. Matsidiso, you have your hand up. Unmute yourself and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you again, Chairperson, and thanks again, Vusi, for your presentation. I just want to really perhaps caution the House around the tendency to sort of exaggerate or over, emphasize the reach even of social media. In the African continent only has about less than 30% of its population with reliable internet connection. So a huge majority of us still not on the internet. I mean, I saw the latest IEC's announcements around the use of social media as a way to sort of try and get people, especially young people, to try and vote and get them interested in elections, etc. But, again, that's only reaching a fraction of society. The rest of society are people that are relying still on, the so-called traditional media. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Eastern DRC, where there's massive, insurgency, political instability, and violence, a large part of that region relies on community radios for the vast majority of information. But if you looked at social media, you would think that, the vast amounts of misinformation, disinformation, fake news around some of the issues that are happening, especially in that region, the tensions, the diplomatic government and the Rwandan government with Paul Kagame, you would think that, a lot of the stuff that's happening is a reflection of what's also happening on social media in terms of the lots of misinformation about the influence of Rwanda to the M23, whether that is true or not, the influence and some of the campaigns that are being done by the regional East African forces on the ground, etc. But a huge majority, I think the latest figures say about 60% of the population in East DRC rely on community radios for their information. So again, the issue of connectivity and the fact that so many people in the African continent are still not connected to the internet or even any social media platform has to give us a sort of another perspective to say, hang on, it's not so much a social media. To what extent are we seeing misinformation, disinformation, propaganda through traditional media outside of social media, especially around the issue of elections? in the continent. Another point, just if you'll allow me, Chair, just one point is, I think the last question that you just read, the role of foreign organizations, foreign governments, is, I know that the example of the Israeli government was mentioned. I mean, we've known that for years, Israel, through a lot of its startup companies, has played quite a huge role in African elections, either through, tech companies that work with the election authority and election bodies in different countries. Zimbabwe, for example, during the tenure of President Mugabe, there was a huge thing around how an Israeli company helped the Mugabe government to sort of win the election outright or rig the election, etc. We're also seeing a lot of Israeli companies, or the Israeli government really, coming through again in the form of, sponsoring influencers to spread misinformation, creating fake accounts. I mean, this also has been done by Russia, for example, in the continent. And I think really we need to see how African governments' foreign policy towards these governments is really allowing the administration of these foreign intervention in African elections. What happened in Kenya, for example, the Israeli governments were able to do that because of its huge influence in Kenya as a country in itself. The foreign policy that Kenya has and relations with Israel have and be to really get away with stuff around this. But yeah, I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matsidiso, for providing a balanced view on the reach of social media. Thank you very much. And we really take note of that and your question. I had seen a hand here. I don't see it anymore. It has been lowered, but there is a question. I will read it out to you, Vusi, because it's directed at you, and it's coming from Samantha Nengomasha. I agree with the opinion that decisions are already made outside of the social media platform. While this is true, it allows justification for crimes against humanity, giving the impression that governments are justified for the prosecution, abductions, attacks, and imprisonment of opposing contenders. Misinformation is therefore not limited to influencing public opinion, but ensuring safety and security for citizens. In your opinion, Vusi, what actions can be taken to ensure that we counter misinformation for clear representation of pre-election and election violence? So that's the question for you, Vusi, there. I was willing to take one last question, but I see there are no questions at this stage. So over to you, Vusi, if you can respond to the questions that have been posed so that we facilitate dialogue.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chido, and the questions that have come up. The first one was on are young people involved in elections or democracy on the ground as they are on social media? I think at face value, and this is my honest opinion, no. And that is the issue generally from, across the board on the African continent, that young people in particular have delegated political responsibility to political leaders, right? So, or political organizations rather. So, for example, let me just give context. During apartheid or during colonialism, we saw people on the ground leading the charge to bring about democratic change, one man, one vote. So there's no political party or there's no one person who actually led the struggle. Yes, there maybe have been symbolic figures of the struggle, but the truth is that democracy or freedom was attained through collective engagement, involvement by the people on the ground. So the mistake then what happened at the turn of democracy or at the turn of independence is that citizens said, okay, now we've attained liberation or we've attained freedom, and now we are taking the political agency and we're giving it to political leaders. That's why you see people generally complaining on social media and leave it at that. right? You never see widespread protests, you never see widespread demonstrations on the African continent at the level at which some European countries would do whenever they're dissatisfied about governments and the way they may be handling things. Case in point currently is France. So I don't believe that young people, so I think today it's easier to sit and tweet rather than to go on the ground and mobilize the communities and mobilize the people. So I don't think young people, or generally, not even young people, all people generally across the continent believe that they must play an active role in governance or on community development. So we have, delegated that political agency to political parties and political leaders. The second one, I think, was from Ausmat City. So it was about the role of mainstream media in curbing misinformation. I think I was reading an article. Is it today? I think yesterday, where some BBC crew members in Ethiopia were brought to task about peddling lies. But although they are not linked to elections in the country, it became quite interesting that BBC, a renowned news broadcaster, were brought to book about them trying to peddle some sort of views or trying to influence public opinion one way or the other on Ethiopia and the issues on the Horn of Africa. Although I'm not really privy to such, I'm yet to, because at this point I cannot say it's facts, but what I know as a matter of fact, that statement is quite contradictory. What I know is that there are generally views around mainstream media, and speaking from a South African point of view, that you'll feel that a certain media house is pushing a certain narrative, that a certain media house is not being objective, but they've never been brought to book. And since we are here as a group of, civil society organizations, academics, and all of that, until it is proven, we cannot then come here and say that that's the case in South Africa. But obviously, general sentiment, in a country like South Africa, is that there are sections of the media that are dedicated to pushing a certain point of view regarding governance, and the order of the day in the country. So yeah, I think that's as far as the role of mainstream media is concerned. The one on what actions can be taken to ensure we counter misinformation for clear representation of pre-election and election violence. I think the issue is understanding that elections are, and this is to Samantha, elections are nothing more than an exercise to authorize a certain group of people to govern on your behalf. The challenge with the African continent is that elections have been tribalized to such an extent that if I'm Bedi, I'll vote for a Bedi, or I'll be sympathetic to someone who comes from the north of South Africa than who comes from the south, or and whatever the case might be. And this is my opinion, to say, until we understand that elections are nothing more than authorizing a politician to govern on your behalf, and not really make it about tribal politics or tribalism or ethnicity, that will ensure that there's some degree of safety and security for citizens. Ethnicity or tribalism is one of the things that led to the bloody Kenyan elections of 2007, 2008. So I do believe that most of the time, or not most of the time, to some extent, people tend to be sympathetic to people who are close to their tribes, and not so sympathetic to people who don't identify with them. So until we understand that this is nothing more than a governance that affects all of us, and not about, I would say, monarchs or kingdoms, so to speak, that then will make it easier to facilitate elections and democracy on the continent.
Thank you so much, Vusi. Thank you for your responses and for sharing your thoughts. Now we want to move to the last speaker, the last but not the least, certainly. And the last speaker is Nomshado Lubisi Nkosinkulu. Nomshado is the head of communications at Media Monitoring Africa. She is a published author and a former committee member of the South African Internet Governance Forum. She has led and implemented strategic communications initiatives for various campaigns and worked on projects in digital literacy, media policy, and media research. She has spearheaded dialogues seeking to address critical issues around communications and media. She has experience in marketing, digital media, public relations, training, and strategic communications. She has key interests in disinformation, digital offenses, digital media, youth development, gender, and media research. She has conducted various lectures and training sessions on information disorder, disinformation, and digital media. So you will now realize why she had to come in last, so that she wraps it up for us in terms of what we have already discussed. So over to you, Nomshado.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear, and we can see you as well.
Perfect. Like other speakers, I had to try and make a plan with my lighting. I'm currently experiencing load shedding, so apologies for that. And hopefully this lighting does stick with me. I don't need to reintroduce myself, but I think it's important for me to kind of echo the work that we do as an organization. I'm from Media Monitoring Africa, which is a nonprofit organization that has been operating since 1993. Our first project, if you may say, was monitoring our first democratic elections, and we've been doing so till date. And as doing that, we realized there are various things such as digital literacy, etc., that truly need attention when it comes to ensuring that we are providing the necessities in terms of resources there. So in doing that, I'm mentioning this because there's I'm coming in from a different angle. I know the previous speaker spoke about disinformation and tried to really give kind of like an outlook on what it looks like now. But for me, I just want to echo a few things. And the first being, we need to realize that disinformation is an intersecting threat. And why I'm saying that is that we are seeing an element of disinformation in each digital offense, right? And by digital offense, I'm not saying online only. Reality is disinformation is also an offline phenomenon. So we cannot take away ugogo, a grandmother who's sitting in the rural areas as a user themselves, because they themselves also, interact with this content. And at the same time, bringing it back to the African experience, which I think was mentioned quite a number of times there, is that when we come to dealing with disinformation, we have to be realistic from an African perspective, and that is we are dealing with a digital divide. So digital literacy is still an issue, access is an issue, infrastructure as well is still an issue. So how do we go about ensuring that at the same time we are arming ourselves and we are really putting the correct infrastructure to deal with this? And I think there's been a lot of talks around, who actually deals with disinformation. And I think the big problem here is that we're always pointing fingers to the people who are actually outside our country when it comes to making these decisions. We're pointing it to outside our borders when I'm now talking big tech. And reality is that it's not only up to them when it comes to combating disinformation. It really needs to be a multi-stakeholder approach. So we need to bring in civil society. We need to bring in government. We need to bring in academia, private sector. Citizens themselves also play a critical role in combating disinformation. And by doing this, we start realizing that we're actually being on the ground from ground up and dealing with policy issues as well. And one of the examples I always use is that reality is hate speech in South Africa might not be hate speech in Kenya or in another country. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with when it comes to reporting online. So just to touch on my case studies that I'm bringing forward to you. In 2018, Media Monitoring Africa saw that there's a gap when it comes to, number one, dealing with the issue of disinformation in South Africa, and secondly, also empowering our citizens to be able to do something about it. And when it came to 2019, we actually launched a platform called Real 411, and we launched it in partnership with the IEC. So meaning this was a platform that worked hand in hand with our electoral process. And this platform basically enables any citizen to be able to upload or submit a complaint that they're seeing online that they think might be misinformation, hate speech, harassment, etc. And in doing that, it was kind of like a year whereby we were trying to see, what is actually out there online, and is this really a platform that's needed? And by the end of that period, we realized that this is something that actually needs to be an ongoing thing, because largely what we picked up was disinformation wasn't really centered around political views or political offerings from your political leaders, vote for this party because of 1, 2, 3. But disinformation came about to prevent an ordinary citizen to actually go to the stations to vote. And that is where the critical point comes in. And that is where, for me, I believe the threat is. When it now comes to hindering an individual who has the right to go and make a decision that will impact the whole country and they themselves as well. So we shouldn't limit disinformation in an electoral election period as just, political views, or even just, painting a specific party in a specific way. It could also be taking away power by not allowing everyone the right to go and vote. And we saw this as well during 2021. We had our local government elections, whereby a simple graphic was, taken out about how people should be bringing their pens, because it was during COVID, and obviously there was a lot of procedures that had to be put in place. And that simple narrative was taken and stretched to a point of saying, if you do not have a pen, you are not allowed to come and vote, right? Once again, it's going back to keeping that person at home and keeping that individual at home without them having the power to go and vote. So Real 411 has really brought together 3 elements, which I think is one of the elements that we've been, speaking about, which is 1, it's independent. And I think we really need that when it comes to dealing with this. Number 2, we judge all platforms on the same criteria and principles. What happened was, and I think we've seen this internationally in other countries as well, where a certain narrative was deemed as disinformation on Facebook, but it was still on Twitter going and spreading the rounds as well. So it's the whole concept of disinformation shouldn't be judged per platform. It should be an all-rounder effect, whereby if we know there's a narrative going out there during the election period that's really going to cause harm, how do we stop it on all platforms, and rather than it being a silos, impact? And then the third thing as well is, let's work on accepted rights based approach, a human rights based approach, because the main thing is we need to protect our democracy. We need to protect, what we fought for as a country and as a continent at the same time. And not to take longer, but I just want to end with 2 things. Firstly, disinformation, whether we like it or not, is really morphing and getting more sophisticated. We cannot look down on it and only have it in social media only. It actually can live offline as well. And it has gotten to a point where we're talking deepfakes. People don't even know what deepfakes are. If you have to tell somebody that I can take your voice and I can take your face and make you say something completely different, they'll look at you and say, how come? How is that possible? And we had a similar situation where a video was being, spread around of a particular leader who was saying a specific narrative, only to find an original video actually said the complete opposite. So we need to start understanding that while we're coming together to figure it out, it's morphing, it's getting more sophisticated. And especially when we're talking about it from an African perspective, we need to be honest with ourselves and say, what are we doing to ensure that we're combating it, at the same time dealing with the digital divide? And my last point, we've been speaking about media and the role of media. Media plays a very critical role when it comes to combating disinformation, because that's the one place that people, any single ordinary citizen goes to when it comes to credible information. I'm not saying that they're perfect, But I do say that they play a very, very important role that we cannot strip away and take away from them. Because I could imagine if there was no radio, there was no broadcasting, there was no newspapers, there was no online media, where are we expecting people to go for credible news? And in reality, they are the ones who are investigating, they are the ones who are going to the source, and they are the ones who are tasked with the responsibility to bring the news and reflect society to people and to enable them to be able to make informed decisions. At the same time, we are supposed to hold them accountable because they're supposed to be transparent, ethical, and ensure that they're doing it from a human rights perspective and approach. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Nomshado. Thank you so much for that brilliant take, particularly on digital crimes. That's something that I'm learning for the first time. There's a distinction you make there in terms of a crime being committed digitally and a digital crime in terms of misinformation and disinformation. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Let's engage in terms of questions. Let me just check and see if there are any questions there. Okay, there is one already. This is for you, Nomshado. Does Media Monitoring Africa do fact checking? So that's the first question. Do they view this as a mandate of their institution as part of the monitoring? And how effective are they, or can they be, in fact checking? So that's the first question. The first two questions are for you, Nomshado. Let's open the floor. Are there any other questions? I do not want to sound like a broken record. I won't repeat my question because it's captured in these two questions. I wanted to pose a question, but I think it's sufficiently captured in these two questions. Let's see, are there any other questions? All right, I don't see any hand. I don't see any. Okay, there, Vusi. Yes, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Chido, and thank you, Nomshado, for that comprehensive feedback. I wanted to ask, as Media Monitoring Africa, in the context of elections, to what extent does the role of political leaders play, and what they endorse and not endorse, play a role in elections? For example, you'll find that a senior government official, a popular politician, can retweet, can like something, share something. Obviously, that puts them in a good light, but might not be the truth. So to what extent does that affect credible news during election time on the political responsibility of political office bearers at that time?
Thank you, Vusi. One last question. All right, I don't see any hand or text. One last question. I want to pose this one to Nomshado. Is a digital crime prosecutable? Is it prosecutable, and what are the procedures or processes if it can be prosecuted? Over to you, Nomshado. You are muted in case you have started responding.
Thank you, sorry, and apologies for my video being switched off, but I think it will definitely spare me my battery life here. Thank you for those questions, and I think they are very good questions. I hope I'm audible now. I just need confirmation. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank
you are
you
audible.
so much. Okay, so around media monitoring and fact checking. So when we monitor media, we are looking, obviously this is based, we don't only monitor elections, we do monitor other topics as well. So such as climate change, gender-based violence, COVID was one of our big ones as well. So there are other areas that we look at when it comes to media monitoring. And when we do so, we are truly looking at the transparency and ethical reporting of media. So whose voice was the loudest is what we look at. So meaning what prominent individual or what cluster of expertise were accessed during this period of time. And it also gives indication during the election period which political party also got the most voice in. We look at issues of gender when it comes to female, male, and other, gender perspectives as well. We look at, what topics were highlighted the most. It's a really in-depth, monitoring process whereby we're looking at every angle of what was basically covered during that election period. And the biggest one I think everyone always looks for is, media bias. And I think Vusi, if I'm not mistaken, spoke about media credibility and media trust, which in all honesty, it is still a rising, not a rising problem, but it's still a problem in the sense that we need to start rebuilding that trust. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that we have ethical reporting, we have, transparent reporting as well. Within MMA, we're not identified as fact checking, although it's one of the elements within Real 411 that we do. So how Real 411 works is that when somebody submits a complaint, it actually goes through a very long process. And especially if it's during the election period, where IEC as well is our electoral body is also involved, it actually goes through us, goes through them, and then an outcome is determined. In doing so, there's 3 experts who looks through the complaint: a media expert, a tech expert, and a law expert. The reason why we're obviously dealing with different digital offenses, which are there and which are still continuing to grow now. And after that, it goes through a secretariat. After the secretariat, it then goes through a review. And through that, an outcome is determined. An outcome can be a takedown notice. So meaning a notice is put forward for that content to be taken down, and obviously awareness around the narrative that is being pushed at that current time.
For some reason, Nomshado, we are losing you there.
Okay, I'm hoping.
Sorry, I was just saying we lost you for a bit there.
Okay, I'm not sure where last you heard me. I hope it was me. If you could just let me know what part you lost me at.
I can't figure out the statement you were making, but just okay, for
I'll just
about
recap.
5 to 10 seconds there.
Okay,
please, yes.
All right. So meaning that it really does go through a long process behind the scenes of investigation, of fact checking, before an outcome is relayed to the public and to the person who did submit the complaint. There are complaints that are not obviously deemed as mis and disinformation. Hence, it goes through that process for it to be determined so. I think the important part here is during 2021, we actually got the tech companies, the big tech companies to come together to start realizing that we need a hands-on approach here. And I think that was an African first, where we had TikTok, Google, we had Meta, which is Facebook now, come together to be able to work with us in ensuring that we are combating disinformation and we react quickly. Because I think everyone can agree, once a narrative is spread and it is false and it was deliberately intended to obviously be a counter narrative to something that was credible, it is very difficult to come with the truth in the middle of all of that and say, guys, this is false. People tend to latch on to what they've gotten in the beginning. And when it comes to now a part where it's time to actually tell, hey, this was not true, this is actually the truth. You have to work twice as hard than the person who actually disseminated that information. And I think going back to political leaders and the role they play, I mean, listen, we've seen quite a lot when it comes to political leaders or anyone in power use their following to emphasize on narratives that are not true. And it's sad because reality is they also have a role to play in this at the same time. And I think that's why part of our efforts was to bring them in the sense that in 2019, we also on the side developed a platform called Padre. So this was a platform where political parties themselves could submit their marketing materials. So those posters that you see, I mean, we're gone with the days where you'd see the post on the robots only, you now see them digitally at the same time. But also reality is that somebody could take that poster and manipulate it to say something completely different. And this was a way to kind of have a platform whereby citizens could go and double check if really did this political party upload this as their official campaign, or is it something that was manipulated and created to push a certain narrative? So that's also where we're given the highlight of the responsibility they have, because at the same time, you know, it's their narratives that are being pushed during that critical time and moment. And I think we saw this during COVID as well, where some political parties used it, you know, COVID and vaccines as part of their main messaging around around the time, and really pushing conspiracy theories and really pushing, you know, some disinformation, especially from YouTube channels that were taken down by YouTube, which I think they did an amazing job, and the amount of channels they had to take down that were really pushing false narratives was quite alarming. So in terms of the role they play a very large role, but at the same time, they do have the power in the numbers that follow them and the numbers that listen and hear them. So this way, it goes back to the responsibility that they need to start realizing as leaders who are leading, you know, us as citizens. And then when it comes to crime, digital crime, so I did highlight a few of the other offenses that are there. And yes, one can go through a legal process for them. So for example, hate speech. In South Africa, we've had quite a lot of instances that were a few that were taken to court. I mean, some were basically still online, but we had a few big ones that really did go to court. And I think for me, those cases did highlight, you know, as well, this beautiful internet that we have, where we're given the, you know, the opportunity to be able to, you know, view say our viewpoints and our opinions, and you know, hold people accountable on the space, is the very same space that one could use, you know, to manipulate and to spread a narrative, or even to harass or to violate somebody's rights. And that's the big part that we need to realize, is that us as individuals, as users, there's also a responsibility that lies there. One of the alarming things that we've seen is doxing, whereby, you know, people's personal information is put online. We've seen a lot of trolling. We've seen a lot of botnets being created, which are false, you know, well, not false, but they are accounts that are basically, you know, created to push a narrative, and they're all saying the same thing. And people would assume that, okay, everyone is agreeing to this narrative, only to find that one person is operating those millions of the different accounts, and even not from the country, but based somewhere else. And those are the dangers when it comes to, you know, yes, social media numbers doesn't necessarily say the count in terms of Africa, you know, in terms of where we interact with our information, but it does also trindle down to offline at the same time. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nomshado, for sharing your very brilliant thoughts. In the interest of time, we have to bring this discussion to an end. But before I do that, may I just invite Dr. Rusero to come on just for 2 minutes. Dr. Rusero, I know you're an orator, but in the interest of time, we have to wrap it up. I'm bringing you on in order to answer those 2 questions. I had promised that we'll give you time. So in 2 minutes, if you can, please respond to the questions before we close it off.
Okay, thank you very much. I would also want to thank the previous speaker, my sister there, reeling from the media industry. I think she had a lot to share. Yes, I also concur with her that issues of misinformation are not only online. In fact, if truth were to be told, Africa has been a victim of misinformation for the past 500 years. That's why we are called a dark continent, etc. So there were critical questions. The first one was, how do you then propose a scenario where we would result in taming social media, given now the advent of artificial intelligence? There was also another question, a follow-up to that, which was denoting to censorship, which is leaned on political preferences. Yes, artificial intelligence is actually an elephant in the room, but in the current context, I think artificial intelligence is still pretty much elitist. I think in the context of our democracy and what we are deliberating, we would rather be asking questions like, how then do we ensure Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you mentioned them, how then can we tame those in as much as issues of misinformation are concerned? And I think previous speakers have also already alluded to a multi-stakeholder approach where you have citizenry responsibility, government responsibility, etc. But what I am convinced is that there must be a certain modicum of arresting certain irresponsibilities on social media. Yes, the unfortunate part is that social media, which is the biggest threat to authoritarianism in Africa and the entire global south, in response, it's the authoritarian regimes which are at the forefront of curbing and taming social media for their own ulterior motives. That's why we have seen some draconian laws that are now being gazetted, legislated, all in the name of trying to address some of these issues. Then Brother Richie also posed a question earlier on pertaining ZANU-PF interference to the work of the broadcaster. I will quickly say the unfortunate part in Zimbabwe is that the model of our national broadcaster, the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, is in form and character state controlled. It's not public media, it's actually state controlled. So automatically the Minister of Information is in charge of actually appointing the ZBC board, the CEO, etc. And you know what it means because the Minister of Information is also a party functionary. So there is a heavy conflation of ZANU-PF and ZBC, ZANU-PF and the state, to the extent that ZANU-PF becomes an extension of a ZANU-PF information department. In those circumstances, it is very difficult. And you would find that whereas social media was an opportune moment to counter some of the propaganda daily churned on national broadcaster, unfortunately, ZANU-PF is also physically and vigorously active on social media platforms. They have deployed what they call Varakashi. Varakashi are those cyber cadres, the cyber warriors, all aimed at diluting information. And at the end of the day, they cause the proliferation of misinformation. Lastly, there's been reference to the role of diaspora. What is then the role of diaspora? That's another folly of social media, so to speak, especially with regards to democracy, because those who are active, those who are vocal, some of them are so detached from the situation on the ground. So if you go to Twitter today, you would think ZANU-PF will be out of power tomorrow. Why? Because of certain illusions and delusions. Social media also give a false hope, especially to the majority of people who are so desperate of change, because much of the protagonists and players of social media, they are actually at times out of touch with the realities on the ground. So I think I will have to stop there, Comrade Chido. Thank you once again. We hope to continue with these kinds of jamborees, because at the end of the day, truth will be unraveled. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you very, very much. It will be amiss of me to not thank you as panelists, Alex, Vusi, and Nomshado. Thank you so much for making time to share your thoughts on this very interesting and almost controversial topic. This was just the first for this year. There will be much more discussion and more webinars. I'll just invite everyone to look out for more information on our social media sites. May I also take this opportunity to thank every participant in this meeting. Thank you so much for making time and for contributing with your questions and with your comments. Thank you very much. I now declare this session adjourned. Goodbye, everyone.